Professor Lynk has published widely in areas of Canadian labor law, human rights law, and international law, and he's also the author of 2 books. In March 2016, the United Nations Human Rights Council unanimously selected Professor Lynk for a 6-year term as the 7th Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Palestinian Territory, occupied since 1967. In this capacity, he delivered regular reports to the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council on human rights trends in the occupied Palestinian Territory. And he completed his term 6 years later in April 2022. And as you know, he was succeeded in that role by Francesca Albanese. Dr. Lynk has written a book in 2022 with 2 previous special rapporteurs, Richard Falk and John Dugard, and that book came out recently. It's called Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, Working Through the United Nations. Dr. Lynk's academic scholarship and his UN reports have been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the UN General Assembly. So it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Lynk here for the 5th lecture, please.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and I have to make one correction. I actually am not a doctor. I taught through my career with just a LLM, but if UNB is offering the honorary mentioned to you that I had served for 6 years as the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian Territory. I have been, in the course of being the Special Rapporteur, and since I ended the office of Special Rapporteur, I've been introduced at speaking engagements many times since then. And while usually people introduce me as a Special Rapporteur, I have been on occasion introduced as a Special Raconteur, which then makes me think I've got to spend the whole hour telling you stories. But perhaps more to the point, I've had at least twice I've been introduced as a Special Provocateur, more similar to what my role was with the United Nations. I'd like to thank the Association of University of New Brunswick teachers for the invitation to give this lecture. It's a great honor to be doing this in the name of Jon Thompson. Before I begin the lecture, I would like to claim a very small indirect connection to New Brunswick. I am from Nova Scotia, and while it makes me a maritimer like many of you, it also means there's some rivalry between these 2 biggest of the Atlantic provinces. But what I can say is something I'm quite proud of, is that my father-in-law, my wife's father, developed a strong connection to New Brunswick in the 1960s. My father-in-law was born and brought up in Saskatchewan, and through dint of having served at the very end of the Second World War in the European campaign in Holland, he was able to get a scholarship at university that he probably never would have had otherwise. A bright man, he excelled in economics and mathematics, and when he graduated in the late 1940s, he joined the Saskatchewan Public Service. And for those of you who know your modern Canadian history, you'll know that it was a revolutionary time in Canadian politics with the 18-year rule of the NDP and the CCF mostly under the premiership of Premier Tommy Douglas, who, as you know, in a vote held 15 years ago, was the most popular Canadian. Don Tansley had the great opportunity to serve under him in a number of senior public service positions as they modernized the government of Saskatchewan and modernized the province of Saskatchewan as well. It really was an extraordinary brain trust that was created under the leadership of Tommy Douglas in the 50s and early 60s. father-in-law was very instrumental in the bringing in of Medicare, the first Medicare program in Canada. He was the head of the Medical Services Board, which survived the strike by the doctors in 1962. And he was instrumental actually in bringing in British doctors to serve the people of Saskatchewan during the Saskatchewan doctors' strike. And as a labor lawyer, I would always feel abashed at seeing anybody running across a picket line. But in that case, I thought to myself, well, let's strike breaking for a better world. In 1964, the NDP lost the election, and that brilliant brain trust of young, energetic civil servants then dissipated to the four winds. And to his great honor, Donald Tansu was asked by Louis Robichaud to come to Fredericton, and he served as the Deputy Minister of Finance for 4 years from 1964 to 1968, and he felt himself as part of a second, if you like, bureaucratic revolution in New Brunswick, as Louis Robichaud began to bring and drag New Brunswick into the 1960s, as well as to try to create the beginnings of equality between Anglophones and Acadians in New Brunswick. And with those 4 years, he then went on to senior service in the federal government, and he renewed his friendship with Louis Robichaud, and Robichaud, after being defeated in 1970 by Richard Hatfield, went on to become a senator for New Brunswick. And the two of them spent a lot of time together in Ottawa during that period of time. And he and my mother-in-law and my wife have very fond memories of the years they spent here in Fredericton. What I want to be able to lecture today on is on academic freedom and what I call the Palestine Exception to it. I'm going to be speaking about experiences of what I call scholasticide, and I'll be explaining that term to you in its accepted definition. I'm also going to be talking about what's been going on in the United States, particularly over the last 2 years, and particularly over the last 8 months with American universities, and as well, I'm going to be talking about Canadian universities and the challenges they wind up facing. But before I do that, just let me take a minute or two to pay tribute to Professor Jon Thompson. We've heard mentioned him before. I knew him obviously by his record. He was a distinguished professor of mathematics and statistics here at UNB. He was also carved out an equally stellar record in terms of faculty unions and in academic freedom leadership. He was the president of the AUNBT. He served as chair of the COUT committee, the Canadian Association of University Teachers Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure, which is probably the single longest lasting and probably its most important of committees in trying to defend academic freedom across the country. I knew his name for 2 reasons. One was a study he had done in 2010 and 2011 with respect to the Canadian government's attempt to pressure the end the government funding to a conference that was going to be held at York University on one state, 2 states, and looking critically at what the futures might be for Palestinians and Israelis in Israel and Palestine. There was a great deal of pressure by what John called the Israel lobby to have the funding cut, and the conference ended. That was unsuccessful in the end, notwithstanding the intervention of a number of cabinet ministers in Stephen Harper's cabinet. The conference went ahead. I was delighted and honored to be one of the speakers with respect to that. And John then produced a long report with respect to the interference, external interference into academic freedom by the rule of the Harper government, and published that in 2011. It's a great read. I reread it again in the last couple of weeks in preparation for wanting to come here, and it's a work that I think will always be attached to John's stellar scholarship. The other issue I want to raise that's attached to John's name is that he chaired a COUT committee of inquiry into the abuse of academic freedom who had targeted Dr. Nancy Oliveri, a prominent hematologist who was a researcher at the Hospital for Sick Kids in Toronto, and the attempts by the pharmaceutical giant Apotex in the 1990s to wind up censoring her research findings. This, I think, is one of the most important academic freedom cases in Canada. Certainly it stands up there with the seminal case involving Harry Crow back in 1958, which really established the foundations for both the political and the legal basis for academic freedom in Canada. This is where Apotex had threatened legal action against her to squelch her research findings that the drug that she and others had been working on and testing had deleterious effects on a number of patients that had been tried upon. And obviously the two big heroes of this inquiry into the saga are Jon Thompson himself, with a great report that he wrote on the issue, and of course Dr. Nancy Oliveri herself, for her tenacity and her academic rigor. You know that due to his health, Jon can't be here with us tonight, but I'm pleased to say that Dr. Oliveri is in the audience. Would you please stand up? So, I should have actually forwarded that to show you Jon's picture and obviously some of the few highlights of the many highlights we could have said with respect to Jon. So, what is academic freedom? It's a term that even among academics is not widely known or really widely or correctly understood. But it has the scope for giving broad protection to professors and universities to be able to conduct their research in a fearless fashion, to be able to teach in a fearless fashion, and to be able to comment on issues involving both the university and the world beyond the university in a fearless fashion that should not be subject to either internal censorship by the university or external pressure by donors or by politicians. What I've quoted to you here is one of the major definitions of academic freedom, which comes from the seminal 1997 Statement on Academic Freedom by UNESCO, the United Nations Economic, Social, and Cultural Organization based in Paris. And in fact, I'm pleased to say that this definition came about largely because of the valiant efforts by Canadian academics who were present at the Paris conference to try to develop a rigorous yet open definition of academic freedom and what it winds up contributing to. And, and this is what is normally regarded as the four pillars of academic freedom in Canada and the United States. We borrowed quite creatively a lot of the ideas coming from academic freedom from the United States, from an association of university professors, the AUNBT, who created two important statements in 1915 and 1940, which we in Canada have then wound up building on. But if any of you who are professors or aspiring professors, you should try to teach yourself with respect to what academic freedom does wind up protecting. Even I, as a law professor in labor law, when I was confronted with issues involving academic infringement of my academic freedom around 10 years ago, didn't know enough to be able to research what the issues were. I've since made myself known because of the issues that I was involved in. But these are all have detailed definitions, each of these four, which are broad, which are generous, and which are limited only by the legal limitations of the law, such as defamation or hate speech. But they give professors the kind of freedom you need to be fearless in your search and inquiry for expanding the definitions of knowledge. And just to give you a 1 minute legal explanation, this is my sole time I'll be giving you a legal lecture. Academic freedom in Canada is not found in the Charter of Rights. It's not found in legislation. It's not found in human rights legislation, and it's really not found in common law at all. The only province that has enacted legislation to protect academic freedom is in Quebec, which came out in 2022. No other province has done this. I know there was a great deal of debate among faculty in Quebec as to whether or not this was a good idea or not. It's there. To the best of my knowledge, it's not really been used in the 3 years since it came in. Where academic freedom is protected is in the negotiated rights that faculty unions negotiate with their universities. And if you look, as I have, among the broad number of definitions of academic freedom in your faculty collective agreements, you'll find how strong they are. You'll find that they will almost always have each of those 4 pillars of academic freedom that are listed, that I've listed here. And these, I think, are by far the most important and protective aspects of academic freedom in Canada. You're not going to get your protections on the Charter. You're not going to get them through human rights legislation. You're not going to be able to find them in legislation. You will find them in your academic collective agreements, and you will find them supported and advanced by your faculty unions with respect to this. So this is really academic freedom in a way that is not, that I know of, in any other locale in the world. This is academic freedom almost entirely a labor law right with regards to this. And what I've quoted there at the bottom is a leading statement by one of the leading arbitration decisions in Canada. There are few concepts or principles more important to the healthy functioning of a university than academic freedom. That should all be tattooed on our left arm as academics to want to remember every day. I want to speak very briefly with respect to the concept of what is now becoming known as the Palestine Exception. This has been around, certainly initially by scholars both in Palestine and abroad in the diaspora, by Palestinian Canadian, Palestinian European, Palestinian American scholars, pointing out the substantial differences between the rights normally extended without thought to most all of us, and how limited and diminished those rights often are extended when it comes to Palestinian scholars who are advocating for the same breadth, the same coverage of Palestinian rights to Palestinians as well. And I've defined it as such, that this is the differential treatment through silence, censorship, disdain, and an inferior ranking of importance by the media, universities, governments, and opinion influencers regarding commentary, advocacy, protests, and scholarship related to the recognized rights of the Palestinians. And here, what I'm referring to are example. I can give you some examples in Canada, obviously in the arts. One recent example with respect to the Palestine exemption was the debate, the long and difficult debate over whether Canada, in the controversy over the funding by Scotiabank to the annual Giller Prize for Canadian literature, because a number of prominent members in the literary community in Canada were opposing the fact that Scotiabank was a donor of the money for the Giller Prize because of its large investments in major Israeli weapons manufacturers. And this came to a head with the agreement by those who won the Giller Prize that the role of Scotiabank would be reduced and then eliminated while they look for new funders. In politics, we can see the long-standing debate over whether or not Canada should recognize the state of Palestine or to declare what is occurring in Palestine as a genocide. The great reluctance it took, actually, a genocide in Palestine for Canada, Britain, France, Spain, and other countries in the global north to recognize a Palestinian state. And one may question, and I'm happy to answer questions with respect to Israel and Palestine in the question period afterwards, but to question whether or not the recognition by these prominent global north countries has come so late in the day that there's really not a Palestinian state left to be able to recognize. In an interview I gave last week to the CBC, I pointed out when I was asked, well, we understand what the diplomatic and symbolic nature of the recognition is. What does it mean in practice on the ground? And I said, look, you know, the mathematics of a Palestinian state are very grim. In 2013, 2014, Secretary of State John Kerry, under President Barack Obama, announced the launch of a new peace process. And he said in his testimony to Congress, explaining why he was embarking upon this, that the rate of settlement expansion in the East Jerusalem and the West Bank was at such a level that we only had, in his words, 18 to 24 months, or it's all over. It will be apartheid. He was later made to apologize for the use of apartheid. At the time John Kerry said that, there were, in the West Bank alone, there were 400,000 settlers. 3 years later, in 2016, at the waning weeks of the Obama administration, the United States allows a resolution to be passed through the UN Security Council, stating that Israeli settlements are, I'm quoting, a flagrant violation under international law. And then going on to say, and again I'm quoting, that the rapid expansion of Israeli settlements dangerously imperils the prospects of a two-state solution. And when that was passed in 2016, when John Kerry made a statement in 2013, there were 360,000 Israeli settlers. In 2016, when the UN Security Council resolution was passed, there were 400,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. In 2025, 10 days ago, French President Emmanuel Macron, who was one of the diplomatic advocates of having an international consensus to advocate for a two-state solution, and came up with the New York Declaration, said, look, we are now 1 minute to midnight with respect to the ability to have a Palestinian state. We're now at 525,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. And I often wonder, 80 years ago, David Ben-Gurion said, when there were 60,000 Israeli settlers coming into Palestine from Europe, escaping the gathering clouds of Nazi Germany, he said, what Arab cannot do his math and figure out that 60,000 European Jews coming to Palestine here means no Palestinian state? We could say the same thing now. Who cannot do their math? What diplomat cannot do their math and figure out that at this present rate of 30,000 settlers a year in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, we now have 750,000 settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank combined, probably means no Palestinian state. Just as these Western powers are arriving at the recognition of a Palestinian state, it is probably the same time that we're administering the last rites for the ability of the Palestinian state to emerge in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. So then we look at some of these instances with respect to the differential treatment. University protests on Palestine, I'll come to in a second, but how they were treated differently and more harshly than a whole history of university demonstrations over various issues over the last 60 years. The designation of a phrase from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, as anti-Semitic, automatically anti-Semitic, has been used by university leaders to shut down protests or even to dismiss university instructors in Canada. When, interesting enough, a ruling by the University on the University of Toronto encampment by the Superior Court of Ontario ruled that from the river to the sea, while it may be heard differently by different people, is not in itself inherently anti-Semitic. Anti-BDS commentary and legislation, I'll be coming to that later. The idea of the conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism is rife within our public debates in Canada and the United States. The 2000 2020 hiring scandal or affair at the University of Toronto, where Professor and Dr. Valentina Azarova had been hired tentatively hired by the University of Toronto to become the head of the International Human Rights Clinic at the Law School at the University of Toronto, when a well-placed donor to the university phoned and said that there would be a lot of opposition to somebody like her because of her critical comments on the Israeli occupation. She herself is Israeli. She herself is a careful scholar of international law, and her criticism was well within the framework and guardrails of international law. Yet the offer to her was rescinded on a spurious ground that it wasn't going to match with respect to Canadian immigration issues. She fought the issue. She finally was offered the issue, but that time she turned it down. But to show that wound up happening at all in Canada, and that would be a criteria for getting an academic position, I think is appalling. And finally, the kinds of many holes we have in the Canadian mainstream media with respect to its accurate coverage, and particularly allowing a much wider range of commentary on what is happening in Gaza and in Palestine. Very briefly, let me just talk about the issues with respect to the designation or arguments over genocide in Gaza. As you can see in the figures that I've compiled here, we now are at more than 66,000 Palestinians having been killed. Recent numbers that were reevaluated by statisticians with respect to war casualties, which were agreed upon by Israeli military figures, said that 83% of the deaths of the 66,000 are civilians, men, women, and children who had no role in combat. That's an over 5-to-1 ratio. That's an astonishing ratio in a modern war of civilian deaths to combat deaths. We have the entire population of 2.2 million Palestinians displaced from their homes. There is no functioning hospital left in Gaza, and there's only about 12 out of the 36 hospitals even are able to offer the work at the limits of a health clinic. They are desperately short of virtually every type of medical equipment. You can starting with healthcare workers themselves, who have been killed in their hundreds, or who have wound up, some of them leaving. There's sparse staff to be able to administer them, anesthetics, bandages, access to clean water, access to be able to wash dirty linens, access to a wide range of medicines, as documented by the World Health Organization and by organizations like Medicine Sans Frontières, are all in desperate need in Gaza. Virtually all Palestinians are suffering starvation at a level of what's called Phase 4, as designated by the United Nations IPC unit. Phase 5 in August, Gaza City, where about 1 million of the 2.2 million Palestinians living in Gaza are living, was designated to be a famine zone. Keep in mind, there's no such thing as a Phase 6. And what the last designation in August said is that unless there is a critical change in the amount of food getting into southern Gaza, which is in Phase 4, we expect that the next designation to be made in early to mid-October will also find that southern Gaza has reached Phase 5 famine regarding this. Before October 2023, before the horrendous attacks by Hamas, which killed 1,200 Israelis, 800 of whom were civilians, and also took about 250 Israelis and foreigners hostage into Gaza, both of which are war crimes under international law. Before then, Gaza had been living for the last 18 years under what I called, when I was Special Rapporteur, a medieval siege. That nothing and nobody was able to leave Gaza, nothing and nobody was able to enter into Gaza. There were 500 trucks a day of humanitarian aid and consumer goods entering into Gaza. After October 2023, that was drastically reduced. And between beginning of March and the end of May, 11 weeks after Israel had unilaterally broke a ceasefire that had been negotiated in January 2025, Israel allowed exactly 0 number of trucks over those 11 weeks to get into Gaza. There was some food left in warehouses, but they obviously quickly wound up being depleted and finished, and that began the extraordinary toll of famine, of starvation, leading to famine in Gaza. Since that, under world pressure, since trucks began to re-enter, it's somewhere between 70 to 130 trucks a day, which is far less than it was before October 2023, and far, far, far less than what it needs Palestinians living in stage 4, phase 4, and phase 5 starvation levels that are there. And when the food was resumed, Israel and the United States set up this so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which instead of having 400 food depots all around Gaza, where the UN trucks would wind up delivering food on this daily basis, there were 4 food depots, 1 in the middle and 3 in the south. So you had people who were passing through phase 4 starvation to phase 5 famine, having to walk 5, 10, 15 kilometers a day in diminished physical fit in order to try to get food and carry back 20 or 30 pounds of boxes back to where their families and their tents were, if they were lucky to be able to get any food at all. And during the course of that, there's been at least 1,400 Palestinians who've been killed either in these 4 zones or in approaching these zones, either through trampling or through being shot by either American soldiers who were there, their ex-soldiers, or by the IDF itself. This has been one of the greatest, most poorly managed humanitarian delivery systems ever in the modern world, and it's been under intense scrutiny and criticism by the United Nations and by leading reputable humanitarian organizations. And 2 weeks ago, the United Nations Independent Commission of Inquiry, which has been around since 2021, it was set up while I was Special Rapporteur, and I came to know each of the 3 commissioners very well. This is a picture of Chris Sedati, who is a senior human rights lawyer and a longtime official with the Human Rights Commission in Australia, as one of the 3 commissioners. It's chaired by Judge Tilley, who was a judge in South Africa, who was a fierce opponent of apartheid in her native South Africa, who later on became a judge on the International Criminal Court, and also served on the Special Tribunal with respect to Rwanda. She knows her international criminal law, and she knows what genocide is. They wrote a remarkable 77-page report, which I urge you all to read. It's written in very accessible language. You don't need a law degree to be able to go through it. And you can see what I say there includes on reasonable grounds that the Israeli authorities and really Israeli security officials have committed and are continuing to commit the following actus reus, the genocidal acts of genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. There are 5 acts of genocide that are listed in the Genocide Convention of 1948 and in the 1998 Rome Statute. To be found guilty of breach of genocide act, of genocide, you only have to commit 1 of the 5 acts in order to satisfy that part of the definition. And they found that the Israeli conduct over the last 2 years had violated 4 of the 5 definitions of genocidal act. You also have to prove genocidal intent, and the report went into some detail listing intentional statements that go to genocide issued by Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog, by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and by former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. I should also point out on this that both Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant have been served with, haven't been served, but arrest warrants have been issued for them by a court, the International Criminal Court, and that prevents them essentially from traveling to the 125 countries who have signed the Rome Statute, including Canada. This, I think, will be an extremely influential report because in a prior decision in July of 2024 at the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice relied on a number of occasions on previous reports by the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry with respect to Israel and Palestine. And this report, given I think its rigor, will also be very influential when the International Court of Justice turns in 2027 to make its decision on whether or not genocide has been committed to Israel. I'm now turning to the issue of Palestine, Gaza, and scholasticide. This might be a new word for many of you. And it certainly was a new word for me when I heard it several months ago for the first time. What it means, and I'll actually bring up the definition for you. But actually, before I show the definition, I want to show you this picture of, these are the 12 institutions of higher education in Gaza. Notwithstanding the fact that they lived under occupation now for 58 years in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, Palestinians are, in terms of literacy and in terms of university accreditation, the most educated population in the Arab world with respect to this. This is notwithstanding the regimes that they wind up living under. So these are the 12 universities that had been in Gaza prior to October 2023. And I asked you to look at a picture of quickly number 2 of the Islamic University of Gaza, and the one for number 3 as well, because I'm going to refer to those in a second. So this is the picture of after the battle of the Islamic University of Gaza. All 12 universities in Gaza have now been either completely destroyed or substantially damaged. Scholasticide, in a report 16 months ago by a number of UN Special Rapporteurs on human rights, said that this refers to the systematic obliteration of education through the arrest, detention, or killing of teachers, students, and staff, and the destruction of educational infrastructure. These attacks, these UN Special Rapporteurs said, are not isolated instances. They present a systematic pattern of violence directed at dismantling the very foundations of Palestinian society. The persistent, callous attacks on educational infrastructure in Gaza have a devastating long-term impact on the fundamental right of people to learn and freely express themselves. If I just give me a second here. And what I want to show you now, here's the question, how do we start it? I'm going to show you a brief 2.5 minute talk on CBC with respect to the third of the universities that I pointed out to you there.
Israel's pounding attacks on Gaza didn't just obliterate homes, they erased the cultural institutions at the center of Palestinian society, such as the Al-Azhar University in Gaza City, where 16,000 undergraduates once studied.
I am going now back also to the library, which has completely burned, to see whether I can find some books to rescue them.
Mohammed Hattab, a biochemist with a PhD, taught at Al-Azhar for 30 years. Now almost 80 and homeless, he took our videographer in Gaza back to the campus, only to find spent Israeli mortar rounds where his science building once stood.
But they think that we are wild animals, as Netanyahu said. We are not wild animals. They are the wild animals because they destroy everything.
Israeli commanders said they found Hamas tunnels under the campus, explaining why so much was destroyed. In selfies, some Israeli soldiers mocked the destruction. Others shot video of them using the university as their own military base.
Look here.
Inside the only structure standing, Hatab found Hebrew graffiti about Israeli sports teams.
Very good, very good. What do they see?
Mixed in with the debris was a young woman's report card.
Philosophy 88. Excellent, excellent marks. They have simply thrown it, the different kinds of books.
In another room, someone else had already started stacking the books that could be salvaged.
What kind of mentality for these soldiers who have done this crime? It is really a crime. I am very, very, very sad. It is one of the most sad days in my life. Everything is bad.
Last spring, a UN panel suggested Israel's actions could be a deliberate attempt to inflict what it called scholasticide, the intentional destruction of the education system. Donald Trump has said his day after plan for Gaza involves not having Palestinians living here, effectively expulsion. The top says that will never happen.
We, the Palestinian people, are determined to stay alive in our country, and we will never leave it. Never.
Book by book, Hatab says Gaza will be restored. Israel's pounding attacks on Gaza didn't just obliterate homes, they erased the cultural institutions at the center.
So you've heard in Chris Brown's report of Israeli allegations that there were tunnels underneath the universities which justified the destruction of this and most of the other universities in Gaza. This UN Commission of Inquiry, which in September released the report with respect to genocide. Its earlier report in March of 2025 looked at the levels of destruction in Gaza. And in these two paragraphs, they talk about the university that was the subject of Chris Brown's report. And you can let me read it. Israeli security forces also demolished part of the Al-Azhar University's Al-Mughraga campus. The commission established that the Israeli security forces had targeted the campus on at least 3 occasions between October and December 2023. In December 2023, Israeli security forces demolished the Faculty of Arts and Human Sciences building and the Al Riyadh Auditorium building through controlled demolitions. The commission identified those involved in the demolition as soldiers belonging to the 749th Combat Engineering Battalion. Images and videos depicting Israeli soldiers dancing and freely moving at the site, and satellite imagery analyzing showing cars parked at the site, have led the Commission of Inquiry to conclude on reasonable grounds that there was no significant threat to Israeli security forces in the area, and therefore no military necessity to demolish the university buildings. And I may not need to remind you that the targeting of civilian buildings, be it hospitals, universities, schools, shops, homes, mosques, churches, are, unless there's an overwhelming military and provable justification, are war crimes and may be crimes against humanity. And if they're part of a larger intent to obliterate a society, could be part of a charge of genocide. So now I want to turn to the United States sorry, just before I leave that, I mentioned the word scholasticide. This is not the only contribution that the war in Gaza is making to the English language. There are other terms as well, which I've never heard of, in my time dealing with human rights. Words like meticide, or ecocide, or domicide, or urbanicide. All of these are fairly new terms. They're not legal terms yet. They've become descriptive social science terms to describe the obliteration of part of a society, particularly a part that's essential to its survival. But I think they're going to become more common in years to come, and I wouldn't be surprised as a lawyer knowing how in international law continues to evolve and absorb new theories and frameworks and guardrails, new paradigms, that these words may well acquire a legal meaning as part of trying to create a greater charge with respect to human rights. As I introduce this issue with respect to academic freedom, the Palestine Exception, and American University, I want to point out something that just hit the news yesterday. I completed this PowerPoint late last week, and there's already 3 or 4 more major developments that have occurred on various aspects of the themes that I'm talking about since. Yesterday, the organization Scholars at Risk, some of you may know it, based in New York, I think headquartered at New York University. It's one of the leading international voices with respect to the protection of academic freedom around the world. Issued its 2025 report, The Right to Think. And with respect to the United States, it said, following the wave of pro-Palestinian protests that occurred during the spring of 2024, many colleges and universities in the U.S. spent the summer developing new time, places, and manner policies that banned or severely restricted student encampments, required advanced registration of protest actions, and implemented harsher disciplinary sanctions. Prior to 2023, Scholars at Risk have recorded 15 to 20 incidents on higher education in the U.S. annually. In 2024, that number rose to over 80 instances. In the first half of 2025, up until the end of June, it recorded more than 40 instances. Moreover, the nature of these attacks shifted. Prior to January 2025, the actions infringing upon academic freedom primarily came from local and state governments. However, from January 2025 onward, the federal government initiated an unprecedented range of actions aimed at controlling university administrations, admissions, hirings, research, teaching, departmental structures, policies and speech, disciplinary policies, internal sanctions, and finances. It's said that the role and interference by the federal government has been unprecedented over the last 70 years. Now this slide, I guess, is meant as a walk down memory lane, because the student encampments and university protests that occurred on American campuses since the war in Gaza began, and especially during the spring of 2024, were part of what I think and what many people think is a long and honorable tradition over the last 60 years of dissent and confrontation over the vital human rights issues of the day. When we look at the specific issues of each of these series of protests, history tells us, I think, and I think this is probably irrefutable, that the students in each case were right. Obviously, the civil rights movement from the 1960s, beginning with sit-ins around 1960 in southern segregated cafeterias and restaurants, then grew into a mighty civil rights movement throughout the 1960s and 1970s, culminating in a number of very important pieces of legislation, particularly the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its successors, all of which are now the threat of being undermined by the Trump administration. The anti-war movement in Vietnam and American campuses began in the early and mid-1960s, culminated in huge protests, and through 1969 to 1972, the anti-apartheid movement in the 1970s and 1980s, which is where I claim my first exposure to organizing and strategy and tactics over advancing the human rights issue. That lasted throughout the 1980s, and I'm proud to say, as I look back on this, I found 11 different universities, Canadian universities, in the 1980s, who adopted divestment policies aimed at eliminating any relationship to companies active in South Africa during that period of time. 11 universities is not a huge number when you consider, even at that time, we would have had in the range of 40 to 50 universities across the country. But it did show that some of the most important universities, including McGill, including my university, including Queen's, took affirmative actions based on student demands to divest some or all of their pension portfolios and their investment portfolios on strictly moral grounds, to distance themselves on South Africa. The environmental movement, the much more dispersed movement with respect to gender, racism, and demands for equality and equity, and of course now the Palestine support movement that's been around for almost 20 years on these campuses. I can't say that every one of them has been successful. Certainly, the environmental movement is now facing pushback and step backs because of the rolling back of environmental policies and the claiming that there's no such thing as climate change in the United States. And the same thing is true under Trump with respect to the protection of diversity, equality programs and gender rights programs and trans rights programs in these countries. But I suspect, having won a range of victories, these particular movements of the environment and over diversity and equality initiatives will in themselves, I think, refine their feet and struggle back against what is happening in the United States. And in each case, I think the energy and the moral vision comes for all of these movements from the 1960s onward comes from student movements. So the protests against the war in Gaza on American campuses began very soon after October 7th, and we saw demonstrations on campuses. We saw calls for university divestment, for the end of institutional relationships with Israeli universities in particular. And by December 2023, the House of Representatives in the United States had initiated hearings into what it called rampant anti-Semitism on American campuses. And it called the presidents of 4 major American universities, one couldn't attend in Columbia, but the presidents of Harvard and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the University of Pennsylvania all showed up. They were ridiculed by the Republican members of the host committee, and within a few weeks, 2 of them were forced to resign: the president of the University of Pennsylvania and the president of Harvard, for the allegation that they were tolerating anti-Semitism and genocidal comments that were made to students, which they never were, and those, for the most part, those comments were never made on those particular campuses. At Columbia, the president eventually appeared before the committee in April of 2024 to address questions with respect to the tolerance, so in the words of the House of Representatives, for allowing anti-Semitism to run rampant with respect to these campuses. The day after the president of Columbia appeared in front of the House of Representatives committee, she called in the New York police in April, and then again later in May, declared the campuses of these encampments and these tents, and wound up suspending many of them. That was still not enough for her to save her position. She was forced to resign in August of 2024, and this was probably because she had lost support on both sides. In the time that she was president, she had suspended the Columbia University organizations Jewish Voices for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine. There were protests against her decisions to bring in the police onto Columbia campus. There were very bitter memories of those being done to clear the campus of anti-war demonstrators against the Vietnam War in the 1960s and the 1970s. Her decision to do so was harshly criticized by the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, and also by PEN America, and by the Columbia College Student Council, and by hundreds of Columbia professors who had signed letters and then staged the walkout. The Columbia Senate passed a resolution saying that she had abridged the fundamental requirements of academic freedom. In turn, there were a number of major donors to Columbia who suspended their donations to the university, arguing that Columbia had not done enough to try to stem anti-Semitism on campus. There were more police arrests of students in late April, and the refusal not to divest, firm refusal not to divest from Israel. When the Columbia Faculty of Arts and Science then adopted a motion of no confidence in the president, within a couple of weeks, she wound up resigning and returning to England. Here we have President Trump on his first day in office, signing Executive Order 14188 on additional measures to combat anti-Semitism. This was his opening shot with respect to attacking, I don't think there's a better word for it, a more appropriate word, American campuses. He created a task force to combat anti-Semitism. His first priority, he said in the executive order, would be to root out anti-Semitic harassment in the schools and on university campuses. And this wasn't simply ideas that came to Donald Trump one sharp and crystal night. There had been an organization you may know as the Heritage Foundation, a major, very well-funded organization in the United States, as a conservative think tank in Washington. It had built up in 2023 and 2024 with the hope of the return of Donald Trump to office, so-called Project 2025, which listed a whole range of talking points on a conservative, a massively conservative agenda for the United States, including how to deal with campus protests and how to deal with issues involving Palestine. And one of the spin-offs from the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, was something called the Esther Foundation, which was set up in October 2024, which the support primarily came from evangelical Christian organizations. And its position, and I'm quoting from their website, quote, America's apparently anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian movement is part of the global Hamas support network. The aim is to dismantle them, and in New York in 2025, it was reported that the second Trump administration had acted upon many Project Esther's proposals with respect to this. Now, to the best of my knowledge, and to the best of knowledge of virtually anyone who is familiar with the campus protests, with the degree of dissent in the American population, but also particularly dissent in American universities, there is no such thing as a Palestine support network. Really what was at the heart of this Esther project was to refuse non-American citizens the ability to be able to attend American universities, to refuse to grant protest permits. It was calling for the conduct of research to uncover criminal activity by these student protesters. It works closely with Canary Mission, which some of you may have heard of, whose primary purpose is to dox the supporters of Palestinian rights. It attacked Middle East or Islamic studies programs at universities, and it attacked curriculum and university classes deemed to either support Hamas, and using that term very broadly, or to be anti-Semitic. This is Vice President J.D. Vance, who who has been instrumental in pushing the agenda of the Esther Foundation. When he was a senatorial candidate in 2021, he gave a speech where he was quoting President Richard Nixon, who had said the universities are the enemy. And J.D. Vance quoted that and added to that professors are the enemy as well. And J.D. Vance's speech he gave in 2021 to the National Conservatism Conference, he said that American higher education is a hostile institution that gives credibility to some of the most ridiculous ideas that exist in this country. If any of us wants to do the things we want to do, we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities. So this becomes the atmosphere by which we're beginning to witness now. And the universities that are targeted, this is only a small list. There's a list of 60 universities that are on the targets of the Trump administration with regards to this. And you can see the amount of money that was being frozen, the amount of research money that the federal government provides to these universities that was being frozen to each and every one of them, unless they wound up agreeing to a comprehensive set of principles that would basically reshape a great deal the way in which they run the university and the way in which they allow what is going to be taught at the university. So the Trump administration was hostile, obviously, to universities allowing any form of protest for Palestinian rights. They wanted to see an end to affirmative action and to quality, diversity, initiative programs. They went after Middle East and Islamic studies programs, and I'll come back to that in a second. They were obviously they started to use a term called viewpoint diversity, which meant they wanted many more conservative professors to be hired to offset what they thought was the radical and loony liberal left who dominated American universities. And as well, which I didn't put in here, is they also wanted to go after funding for support for trans students and trans athletes. In fact, a substantial amount of money was cut from, I believe, the University of Pennsylvania for allowing a trans swimmer onto the university swimming team. And as well, obviously, either the pretext or the blunt attack was their perceived failure by these universities to protect Jewish students and for allowing Semitism to be widespread with regards to this. So Columbia University it reached a settlement with the government in August of 2025. And there were two basic approaches by American universities on what to do with respect to this unprecedented assault on institutional autonomy by universities. One was to negotiate with the Trump administration to try to limit the damage as much as possible. For Columbia, it meant for the agreement that they provide the U.S. government, you see there were standardized test scores and grade point averages, including informational weights, because the Trump administration was obsessed about trying to see if less qualified minority students would be let into American universities over and disadvantaging students, white students or students from other racial backgrounds. They insisted upon having merit-based admission policies and the ending of these EDI programs. They wanted universities to adopt, as a legally binding policy, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition on anti-Semitism, which I will come to a little bit later on. And they wanted to broaden its commitment to combating anti-Semitism. They placed the well-renowned Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies program under university administration, which meant forcing out most of its current directors. And in turn, in order to get the $400 million from the federal government for research grants, Columbia agreed to turn over $200,000, often called a ransom note, to be able to free up that $400 million. And as well, the university agreed to reform its discipline panel procedures to be able to act much more quickly and probably much more harshly upon students who break perceived student codes. Harvard took another tack, or did it. Harvard initiated litigation in spring of 2025 against the United States government. It had much the same issues of what the Trump government wanted from it. You see, it wanted to put a lien on all Harvard assets. It wanted a changing the leadership in problematic departments, and it wanted more viewpoint diversity, i.e. the hiring of more conservative professors. Harvard refused. It said this was a significant breach of institutional autonomy, which is the centerpiece of trying to protect academic freedom and ensuring the excellence of American universities. So it sued the government over the freezing of $2.4 billion in research funding. And in the beginning of September, it actually won a significant victory at the U.S. District Court in Massachusetts. The ruling by the District Court struck down the cancellation by the U.S. government of the $2.2 billion in research funding. And the court rejected as unconstitutional the government's attempt to force campus changes, stating that it would violate Harvard's First Amendment rights and academic freedom. It rejected as well U.S. administration arguments that it launched these punitive actions primarily because of Harvard's inaction on combating anti-Semitism. In the court's view, this was a smokescreen to bring the university in line with its preferred ideological viewpoint, and the research cuts in their face that the court had very little to do with condemning or combating anti-Semitism. I should point out that yesterday, I haven't had a chance to read the ruling, but I've read the newspaper reporting. The Guardian is reporting that Trump says that there's a $500 million settlement that he's hoping to reach with Harvard. They're now negotiating the details, he said, as a condition of restoring the billions of research grants. So there's no official announcement, no comments yet that I could find from Harvard today with respect to this, but this seems to indicate, if it's true, that even though the court granted Harvard a substantial victory at the beginning of September with respect to this, I think every American litigation lawyer or constitutional lawyer will be looking ahead and saying, I can win at the district court. I can probably win at the Fourth Circuit of Appeals here. I have no chance if this goes to the Supreme Court of Canada, the Supreme Court of the United States with respect to this. You think of the four different branches of the American government: the White House, the executive, the two houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the Supreme Court of the United States. The Republicans control all four. And eventually your lower court substantial victories may not last very long. So if this is true, that Harvard is now considering this kind of settlement on these terms, that may be the thinking as to why they're doing that. But I do want to point out that Harvard isn't the angel that it may be portrayed to be. You see in the bottom part of here, Harvard did take a number of steps which would be in conflict both with student codes, but also the broader issues of academic freedom. They removed the leadership of the Harvard Center for Middle East Studies with no stated grounds for doing so. It ended several programs that were at the Harvard Divinity College related to Palestine and Palestinian institutions that they had with Beer Zeit University in the West Bank. They suspended its research partnership with Beer Zeit University as well, and they also suspended the Student Palestine Solidarity Committee. So these were the steps that Harvard took aggressively to be able to, if you like, remove the issue of anti-Semitism when it reached the court to make its arguments beginning in June. Final point I want to make with respect to the United States has to do with this story, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian, born in a refugee camp in Syria, who made his way to Beirut as the civil war began in Syria, and actually worked for a while with the British Embassy in Beirut, administering scholarships for Syrian students to go study in Great Britain. He also worked for a while in Beirut with UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the agency that provides services for Palestinian refugees in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. He made his way to the United States on scholarship. He became a graduate. He graduated from the graduate program in International Affairs at Columbia. He married an American, a dentist, and when he was arrested on the 8th of March, because I think his son was 2 months away from being born, during the spring of 2024, during the encampment at Columbia, he played a key negotiation role as being, if you like, the elected leader of the students in negotiating with the university. And statements made by university leaders who dealt with him found them to be realistic, rational, to be a good person, to be a negotiator on the other side, someone whom they could respect, someone who said, I think I can get this, would probably be able to keep his word with respect to this, and who gave very good arguments in advancing things that the students wanted. So the encampment in Columbia came down in May and June of 2024. In March of 2025, when he was on his way home to his apartment near the university, he was then arrested by ICE officials on a surprise. His wife was there. He was then taken to a detention center in New Jersey, and then kept in a ICE detention center in Louisiana for the best part of 3 months until he was finally released on a temporary court order, returned to New York at the end of June. Has been there ever since. And this is the explanation given by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio as to using this very thin legal basis for why he had the power to be able to arrest him, where it says that the Secretary of State must personally determine that the alien's presence or activities would compromise a compelling U.S. foreign policy interest. It goes on to say that Mahmoud Khalil in anti-Semitic protests and disruptive activities which fostered a hostile environment for Jewish students in the United States. This is by the framework and the wording from what we got from the Esther Project with respect to the role of students. That if you are protesting against the war in Gaza, if you are protesting for Palestinian rights, then you're part automatically of a greater Hamas support network, and therefore must be guilty of engaging in anti-Semitic activities. And you can see where it says the actions and continued presence of Khalil in the U.S. would undermine U.S. policy to combat anti-Semitism around the world and in the U.S., in addition to efforts to protect Jewish students from harassment and violence in the United States. I did not mention that a significant number of the students at Columbia, at Harvard, and at many of the other encampments in the spring of 2024 were themselves Jewish. There's no such thing as a monolithic Islamic perspective on things. There's certainly no longer any claim that it could be a monolithic Jewish perspective on this. And many of the foremost protesters and supporters of these encampments in 2024 and beyond were Jewish students who, in their own way, were beginning to question their allegiance to Israel, or to rethink what it means for the distance between supporting Israel and supporting human rights with regards to this. So, what I do want to mention, if I just get my page back here, is that yesterday there was another major victory, judicial victory, in the U.S. District Court of Massachusetts, where this was actions brought by the AUNBT and the Middle East Studies Association about litigation against the Trump administration to a judge who actually was a Reagan appointee back in the late 1980s. And the District Court of Massachusetts ruled, and I'm quoting here, semi-quoting, Trump's policy of arresting, detaining, and deporting non-citizens, students, and faculty members for the pro-Palestinian advocacy violates the First Amendment rights for expressive freedom. Trump's administration's ideological deportation policy, in the words of the judge, is unconstitutional. The Constitution protects both American citizens and non-citizens residing in the U.S. Trump's decisions, quoting again, were truly scandalous and unconstitutional suppression of free speech. So, there you have it. There are judicial victories that warms the heart of any lawyer in this regard. Whether or not these are lasting victories are something we're going to have to wait and see. I've got to say that I've only covered really Columbia and Harvard, and I'm not going to, I don't have time, I know I've probably got overtime already, to mention the many other universities that are also under these kinds of restrictions. Brown is supposed to be giving $50 million back to giving $50 to the Trump administration to release research funds. The whole campus, the 10 campuses of the University of California university system are under serious attack, particularly with respect to the kinds of courses that they are offering, the kinds of EDI programs that they have established, and their commitments to various area study programs as well. There isn't really a major university in the U.S. that hasn't felt the wrath of the Trump administration in the last 8 months with respect to this external political interference in what they are doing. But I'm running out of time, and I want to just very briefly be able to talk about academic freedom and the Palestine Exception in Canada. I'm going to be very brief as I go through this, and this doesn't do justice to Poland, sadly. But I should say, it is clear that as worrisome as these attacks on academic freedom are in Canada, they come nowhere near the scale of what is happening today in the United States. There is still a line of sanity on the 49th parallel in Canada. And our troubles, as worrisome as they are, pale in comparison to what professors, students, and universities are facing in the United States. This is simply a brief slide I have with respect to the student encampments that occurred in the spring of 2024. The demands of those students, as were the demands elsewhere, was the disclosure of university investment, investment both their pension plans and their endowments with respect to ties they may have with either weapons manufacturers or to Israel, as well as to support direct and indirect, the investment of direct and indirect investments which support Israel, and to suspend all institutional partnerships with Israeli academic institutions. There were 4 different universities I'm going to try to mention in a very brief period of time. The University of Toronto, the University of Alberta, and the University of Windsor all took 3 different approaches to this. The University of Toronto allowed or permitted attempts to be on the campus for several months while urging them through negotiations to disband, saying this is one of the most historical parts of the university and you're ruining our tourist appeal. And eventually this went to court on an injunction that was sought by the University of Toronto. I'm proud to say there were a number of lawyers, a number of labor lawyers in Toronto and elsewhere who participated on the side of the students, on the side of academic university staff positions, and on the side of university faculty positions in support of these students' right to academy. The decision, which is a long decision to want to go through, I'll just say very briefly, the university, the judge in the Superior Court of Ontario rejected most of the arguments raised by the university that there was hate speech that was of such an intensity that compelled the encampment to be brought down. There was anti-Semitism, which compelled the camp to be brought down. There was destruction of property, which compelled the camp to be brought down. None of those arguments were found on the evidence of the judge to be persuasive. At the end of the day, he said he granted the university the injunction primarily on the issue of property rights, that the university ultimately has the ability to be able to decide who can be on campus and under what circumstances. There were, I think, very eloquent arguments made by a number of lawyers with respect to Section 2B of the Charter with respect to freedom of expression, and Section 2C of the Charter with respect to freedom of assembly. He said their arguments were these supersede these property rights on this kind of issue in the context of a university, and those were rejected. I think for most of the lawyers I talked to who fought and lost on this, said that for a losing decision, they got a fair number of, mini victories with regards to this. But that's what happened there. Then we have at the University of Alberta, where fairly soon after the tents went out, the university president brought in the police, and the police wound up taking down the encampments. And again, arguments were raised with respect to the right of assembly, the right of expression, but this was the harshest type of approach to these encampments. Then there was the University of Windsor. The University of Windsor tells itself and tells the world that it's a university that's built on social justice and access to justice as well, and that it serves minority communities, it serves those who are equity seeking, and it has a different kind of mandate from other universities. And I think following consistently with that, the university administration actually opened up substantive negotiations with the students, and ultimately resulted in an agreement that said that the university, which did not have any institutional ties with Israel, would not seek to have any institutional ties with Israel unless and until Palestinians received self-determination. It agreed to go through an extensive review process with respect to its divestments. And if those divestments wind up crossing the line with respect to recognize international human rights, then those investments would be reviewed and most probably ended with regards to this. It was, I thought, an honorable way for a university to wind up negotiating with the students. There was a difficult back and forth, but they eventually came to an agreement they said all could wind up living with. That agreement was subsequently attacked in court for being anti-Semitic. I've read the agreement many times. There's no mention of Jew or Jewish in the report. There's mention with respect to the concerns of the students with respect to the decimation of the population in Gaza. There is concern with respect to investments in Israel. But I thought it was probably the best agreement that could have been reached in those circumstances, in the way in which other universities could have gone up forward with regards to this. And the final one has to do with the Trump Metropolitan University. Very briefly, students in mid-October 2023, a number of law students at the Lynk and Alexander Law School at the Metropolitan University signed a letter which became public, which was very critical of their statements made by the law school administration for expressing concern and empathy with respect to October 7th, not doing something in equal weight with respect to both what was happening to the Palestinians, which is clear within 2 weeks, the massive bombardment going on in Gaza, nor to what had happened to the Palestinians during the previous 56 years of occupation. The letter could be generously described as being perhaps intemperate, perhaps unpersuasive, perhaps damning in some ways. But at the end of the day, and after and then what happened was, I think 80 different law firms in Toronto and Ontario said, we will not hire any student who signed that letter. And any student applying to us from TNU has to give an attestation that they did not sign that letter. As well, the Ministry of the Attorney General in Ontario said they wouldn't hire any students from TNU who had signed that letter. The university asked the former Chief Justice of Nova Scotia, Michael MacDonald, who headed the mass casualty inquiry in Nova Scotia between 2020 and 2023 to come and do a report. And I'm pleased to say, I mean, he looked at the letter, he interviewed and spoke to a number of stakeholders across the spectrum with respect to this. And his findings in the end, he said, after careful consideration, I have concluded that the students' participation in the letter, while damaging and hurtful, were nevertheless saved from sanction as expressing a valid exercise of the freedom of expression in accordance with the university's statements on freedom of expression and speech, which I thought was an incredibly honorable way to pull that through this. The judge really showed that he was listening with regards to this. And he also came to the conclusion, he said, simply put, this is a greatly flawed letter which caused significant unnecessary harm. However, the harm was unintentional in the face of the appropriately robust free speech rights we have articulated. There was no other avenue to raise participation in this letter to the level of sanctionable conduct. It was not anti-Semitic. So I thought that was probably, and then to his credit at the very end, he actually said, he's actually got a page or two telling the students, look, being a law student and being a lawyer means persuasive. You're using your fingers on a keyboard, you're using your mouths as your tools for trying to persuade somebody with respect to this. And I thought he gave exceptionally sage advice to these students on how to wind up being, how to use their lawyer skills and to develop their skills of persuasion in the future. And he said something like, you know, when you're in an argument, in a courthouse, you acknowledge the other side's argument. You give it credit, and then you say why their best arguments are not up to scratch and why yours are superior. So for those of you who are law students, or want to be law students in this course, or even lawyers in this course, sitting in this class today, you may do well to want to look through the McDonald report, particularly those last several pages on persuasion. I'm almost done here. I will be done sooner. So I just want to be able to point to you that Cal has very strong statements with respect to academic freedom in time of conflict. This was issued just a month after what happened on October 7th. And they were very tough, I think, and very principled, saying academic staff must not suffer any institutional penalties because of the exercise of any of these rights. And then again, a further statement in April 2024 with respect to freedom of expression and free protest on campus, obviously in reaction to the encampments that are going on. And they say at the end, academic freedom cannot thrive when freedom of expression is constrained. You know what, I think in the interest of time, these are important pieces that, just keep on moving forward. I'm going to skip these last couple of parts, as important as they are. I just want to say, by way of conclusion, with respect to this, that, you know what, actually, keep on moving forward. Let me just say one quick word with respect to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, I think we all agree, is both vile and exists, and it does persist in our societies. The danger always is, one danger is always overestimating or claiming that many things, particularly when there's criticism of Israel, tend to be anti-Semitic. I've certainly been on those short ends of those criticisms before, particularly when a Special Rapporteur. But this is the decision coming from the University of Toronto, ruling on that gave the University of Toronto the injunction that it was looking for. And I thought he was very generous in how he laid out the fact that he didn't find anti-Semitism. He said, I did remove the comments that he did include that were made in and around the encampment, but he found no proof that any of the organizers or participants in the encampment and use of that kind of speech. And he noted that the respondents, the students, correctly noted that when issues of hate speech have arisen, they would address them immediately, as in the case of offensive shock messages found in Lynk that were removed in short order. The last slide I'll show, I have 2 slides up. The last slide, Kenneth Stern, I don't know that name means very much to you. He's a well-established university professor at Bard College in upstate New York. He is the author of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has caused so much controversy, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. And he opposes the way it's being used to bring into law or bring into university speech codes. He said, and this is from a report I just read the other day that he has just released, the history of the abuse of the IHRA definition demonstrates the desire is largely political. It was not so much a desire to identify anti-Semitism, but rather to label certain speech about Israel as anti-Semitic. This assault on the academy using the IHRA definition as a key ingredient is McCarthyism. And will also the Trump administration's attacks on higher education, including pressuring universities to adopt the IHRA definition, will profoundly impoverish debate on campus. Students will be chilled from arguing or even inquiring about subjects seen as their fault. So my conclusion is this. Number one, what is going on now in the United States, particularly with this integration of anti-Semitism, with arguing for the affirmation of Palestinian rights, is deeply disturbing. Academic scholars in the United States, particularly those who research issues of McCarthyism and the McCarthy period in the 1950s, are saying today that this time is worse. That where McCarthy was one senator who did have a network of other political leaders who support him in his attacks on universities, on the army, and in other major institutions in American society, is nowhere near the weight that is now being brought by the full U.S. federal government, as well as a number of state and local governments, with respect to banning BDS. 38 states in the United States ban BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions with respect to this. The enormous pressure being put on American universities, and I guess we'll all live with regret if it's true that Harvard is going to sign an agreement with the Trump administration, is the biggest single external interference in American universities in probably the long history of the American Republic with respect to this. We are always susceptible to having viruses cross the 49th parallel, and it's something we should all worry about, and where we can give support and solidarity to professors, to students, and to university administrators profoundly concerned. I have a first cousin of mine who I chatted with a couple of weeks ago when she visited Nova Scotia. She's the provost of a university, small liberal arts university in central Iowa. Iowa's a red state. She's in Des Moines, which is a blue city. And she says that she had been hoping for several more years as provost, but she said she's made up her mind, given the scale of attacks and the scale of setbacks for universities, the scale of fear, she says, and the chill that is occurring, that she's now going to step down as provost at the end of this coming year. And I assume that must be the thought of a lot of university administrators in particular. There's never been a more difficult time for a university administrator than now. In Canada, we don't face the same onslaught. Yes, there have been interference coming externally towards professors or on university programs. In October 2023, the Ontario Minister of Higher Education attacked several university professors, including a good friend of mine, for their statements with respect to Palestine in the legislature, where she is immune from being sued for defamation. And the COUT very quickly issued a statement condemning her interference with this. The slide I wasn't able to show you with respect to the firing of a college professor in Langara College in Vancouver came at the instigation of the then Minister of Higher Education in British Columbia, an NDP member, I should say. And the follow of that controversy was that professor was fired again, but then the Minister of Education also lost her position as well. And that may be, hopefully, a reminder to other ministers of higher education as to where they should be carrying the tongue with respect to this. But you also feel with respect to students, who I know probably are facing a chill on Canadian campuses as to what they can do. Because what they're asking for with respect to an end to institutional relationships with Israeli universities, an end to using university portfolios for their pensions and their general portfolios with ties to Israel. There were noble battles fought 40 years ago with respect to South Africa, and many of them were successful. There's no reason why that example, that precedent, and that energy shouldn't be used now with regards to this. So let me just close with this. We're all familiar with the statement by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. when he said that the arc of the moral universe is high, but it bends towards justice. And I've often agreed with that. And then I read a subsequent statement by one of his aides, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who said, yes, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, but we got to make it bend. It doesn't bend by itself. So all of this has to be, I think, a concern, an ambition for all of us to safeguard academic freedom. I think we're in good hands in Canada. And one difference I do want to point out is that 20% of American university professors are unionized and have collective agreements and can therefore bargain enforceable academic freedom clauses. 98% of university professors are either covered by collective agreement or covered by a memorandum of agreement with their university that mimics collective agreements. That is one enormous positive difference in our favor for our ability to be able to defend academic freedom. It's your faculty associations that are going to be able to do this because they have the legal power to be able to use those creative and often broad definitions of academic freedom for the benefit of us all. So let's wind up using those and make that arc of history move as we make it. Thank you very much. Or I'm happy to go to the reception and Pete can approach you more informally, whatever you like. I've spoken longer than I planned to.
So let's take a few questions here, and then maybe towards the end, and then we'll continue outside. Questions? Yes.
Is there a compelling reason why you're still using the badly outdated 66,000 debt?
Sorry, we've got to take the.
So is there a reason that you're still using the badly outdated 66,000 casualties when the Lancet's most recent analysis suggests it's closer to like 680,000? And second would be, are we aware of this university response to its students organizing and trying to get their estimate?
It sounds like there's maybe several questions there. The first question has to do with I'm using the 66,000 Palestinian dead in Gaza over the last 2 years, which is the official statement by the minimum number of Palestinian deaths set by the Gaza Ministry of Health. You have correctly pointed to the fact that there are some other studies which have indicated that the death rate among Palestinians is likely quite higher. I'm using the 66,000 because that's what Gaza uses. I expect that if there's a ceasefire, the ability to be able to clear the rubble, there'll be tens of thousands more Palestinians who've been dead and unaccounted for in the rubble. Whenever I do write about this, I will often make citation to those 2 or 3 articles, largely in the British Lancet, which estimate, but it's an estimate, that the death rate is significantly higher, either in the 80 to 90,000 range. I've also seen it in the 186,000 death range as well. But we won't know for certain what that death range is until the ability to be able to do that kind of counting is available in Gaza. I missed your second question.
Just whether you were aware of this university's response or non-response to its student body trying to get disclosure and divestment.
I'm not aware. I mean, aside, quite frankly, of Windsor, I'm not aware of any other university in Canada that has taken those obligations and requests coming from student actors pushing them to do something meaningfully. Yeah, again,
So we have both.
tell you what, I'll let you come in a second. Let me take the question here.
So go first, and then Carol.
Okay, how's this? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, Nicole Byrne, I'm a professor at the Faculty of Law here, and I have a group of law students with me. The example at Lynk and Alexander is very alarming. When that happened, I could feel a chill in my students because they said to me, well, if it's going to affect our ability to get an RFA job, and I'm carrying however much debt, and I've got serious issues with that, I'm probably less likely to protest. Then I went to a conference, and the chair of political science at McGill said, well, students have academic freedom. So I now have a section of my course syllabi that's student academic freedom. But as you mentioned, this is kind of a right that comes through labor law and collective bargaining. So do students have academic freedom beyond what is aspirational or we hope they do, and relying on the university to support them when maybe that's a little more tenuous now than it should be?
Then everybody have heard? Okay, very good. It's my view, and I think the view of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, that only professors have academic freedom. There are two types of expressive freedoms in Canada. The ones that professors have on campus to be able to, in their teaching, their writing and research, their ability to criticize the university administration or each other, and their ability to criticize the outside world. And that's quite broadly defined. It doesn't belong to anybody else but the professors. Students have expressive freedoms that are guaranteed either through the charter or more likely through charter values, which are also quite broad. And the Supreme Court of Canada has defined speech rights in a very broad way. I used to teach constitutional law, and we spent a lot of time going through what Section 2B winds up giving. So, in many ways, my ability to criticize the world as a professor, even though if I was a physics professor, I could still criticize Canadian government's policy on Palestine. It doesn't have to be within my academic expertise. Students have virtually the same broad freedoms with respect to this. I've not seen, and there has been a university case involving students at the University of Alberta in 2012 that went to the Court of Appeal, the Prigent versus University of Alberta case, that gave very broad freedoms for students. I think it had to do with wanting to set up anti-abortion tables in the student union building with respect to that. Yes, there are student codes of conduct at the university. I suspect some of those student codes probably violate the more expressive general rights that Canadian university students would have as a Canadian citizen. And I think that's pretty a problem with our civility codes. I'm happy to give a much greater lecture later on with respect to this, but I think you have broad rights that you may sometimes have to fight for against what the university codes wind up saying for students. Sorry, here and then over there. Okay.
Voices of the New Brunswick chapter, and also been a Palestinian solidarity activist for the the hate speech standards, the definition of hate speech, and I do think of it in that case because there's at least a couple of things that have happened since, and I wonder if you think they might be changing things. So one, of course, is the federal government's handbook on the implementation of the IHRA, and the ideas in that handbook about where law enforcement should be doing things, what might become part of our law in Canada, and which is, of course, the IHRA initially said, this is just for privacy, it's not supposed to register, etc. So there's that, and then the recent promulgation of Bill C-9 by the federal government, and the changes that it is proposes to make to hate speech. So please, tell me what you think.
Okay, let me see. I think I hear two questions with respect to that. I'll try to answer. One is the Canadian government's approach towards the implementation of the IHRA definition. And I did have a slide on this. If I can briefly summarize, the principal problem with the IHRA definition is that it uses 11 examples to be able to illustrate what anti-Semitism might be. 7 of those have to do with Israel. And I think certainly the use of the IHRA definition in the United States shows that that explicit reference to Israel in the definition of the anti-Semitism definition indicates that it's meant to have a broad use, and it's been used as a weapon, certainly now under the Trump administration, but it had been used before under the Biden administration as well. If for example, says that it's anti-Semitic if you think that the creation of Israel was a racist endeavor. I think I have met very few Palestinians in my life who don't think that the creation of Israel and the dispossession of the Palestinians was a racist endeavor. So I don't see that as being A, off the mark to debate, and B, nor do I think it's anti-Semitic to be able to raise that as a political or historical question. What's the state of IHR definition today in Canada? The Canadian Parliament, early in the Justin Trudeau regime, passed a motion in Parliament, supported by both the Conservatives and the Liberals, endorsing the IHRA definition. It's not legally binding, it's simply a motion. The federal government has now used that motion to implement in terms of its anti-racism policy. I think the Canadian government probably is getting good legal advice to say that if we actually try to pass the IHRA definition into law, it would be struck down on a Section 2B argument, a freedom of expression argument, under the Charter of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and therefore wouldn't survive. So it's trying to bring in the IHRA definition through other means at a policy level. There was an attempt in Ontario, I think in 2016, 2017, to pass the IHR definition into law, and I think that failed. And that's the only time I know that there's been an attempt, a serious attempt, at legislating the IHRA definition. And for those of you who are still curious about this, many different Jewish groups around the world have collaborated and have come up with alternatives to the IHRA definition. The Jerusalem Declaration is one. I've forgotten the name of the other one, but I look at the other two that have come up, and I say those sound to me sane definitions. They don't rely upon definitions tied to defending Israel, and the way in which they define discrimination or bigotry towards Jews would be similar to the ways in which we would define bigotry or discrimination towards almost anybody else. It doesn't exalt it or put anti-Semitism on a different sort of pedestal. I've forgotten your second question. Oh, Bill C9, yeah, look, it's interesting you raise that. There was a story the other day in the US about, what Bill C9 plans to do is, it's an anti-hate extension of the definition in the criminal code. And among other things, it will prohibit hostile demonstrations in front of synagogues, mosques, churches, and have a safe space, similar to, I think, what criminal law had done 20 or 30 years ago with respect to having a safe space around abortion clinics. One of the issues with respect to that is that, and this occurred last week in the United States, is that there's been ongoing moves to have Israeli real estate firms combined with Canadian and American real estate firms selling West Bank settlement projects, selling houses, selling apartments, selling condos, selling property. And those are sometimes held in hotels. I think they're now beginning to realize we should hold those in synagogues. And so when there are demonstrations near synagogues protesting the illegal sale of Palestinian property through Israeli settlements, those are now deemed to be not directed towards the sale of illegal properties in Israel, but are directed towards a faith-based organization and a faith institution. That was the case in, I believe it was in New York last week when that occurred, and that would be a repetition, I think, if Bill C9 comes into being. I've got to confess, I haven't spent a lot of time going through C9. I know that's one of the disturbing aspects of it. There may be other disturbing aspects as well, but that's as far as I get with respect to my ability to take a look at it.
We'll take one more question.
As quick as possible. I have a general question about the upholding and imposition of law in modern democracies, and I will relate to this question because of what's happening in the US over the last couple of years. So, generally, in modern democracies, you have an executive branch of the government and a judicial branch of the government. So, suppose the judicial branch directs the government to do something about that's happening in the society. The executive branch will do it. That's one thing that can come out of the system. Another thing that can come out of the system is if the judicial branch gives an order that restricts the executive in some manner. Now, if the executive has members which have some respect for constitutional norms, they will follow it. But there are situations in which members of the executive they have no respect for constitutional norms, and the system, there's nothing in the system that has any anything that can, like, there's nothing in the system using which something can be done about it. I mean, for instance, in last year in the US, regarding the deportation of Tilley Garcia, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unlawful after he was deported, but the executive just said, oh well, too bad, but they didn't do anything about it. This question also arises in the context of the arrest conversation for Benjamin Netanyahu and the former defense minister of Israel at the International Criminal Court, because most of the executives of the countries which are supposed to arrest them if they ever set foot on these countries, they just don't have any respect for the constitutional norms around these arrest warrants. So, what should be done about this? Like, what can be done to change the situation?
I'm not sure I can give you a short answer, but very frankly, you've asked a very broad question, a very pertinent question, a very vital question with respect to this. You know, I guess my short answer would be this, is just the absolute requirement for vigilance. I'm trained as a lawyer, I think like a lawyer, and I think that solutions can be found in the law. I'm also I've been abused of that many times, and realizing that there are other solutions as well, ordinarily through civil society organizations, civil society mobilization. the ability of these kinds of organizations to put political pressure on politicians through mobilization, through demonstrations, through op-eds, through creative writing. There's a whole range of people. And if you look at the polls in the United States and the polls in Canada that have been issued in the last several weeks are very strongly in favor of an end to the war in Gaza, to the imposition of accountability on Israeli leaders for what they have done, and a general sinking, this is significant sinking, of the standing and admiration and status of Israel, both Canada and the United States, let alone Europe. If there ever was a moment to be able to speak loud, to mobilize, to speak to your political leaders, to be able to write op-eds, to be able to mobilize on university campuses and doing meetings like this, to doing teach-ins like this, to putting internal demands on your university administration like this. There's never been a better moment. You know, it saddens all of us that it has to come at the extraordinary amount of blood that's been shed with respect to this. But, you know, every crisis presents an opportunity. And here is a crisis now that opens the doors to people listening with respect to this at the university level, at the city level, provincial and federal level. So there's a lot that can be done if a little bit of creativity and a little bit of courage can be shown. And that's, I think, the best answer I can give in a short period of time.
Great, that's Lynk again for